The things that got me into music, I would say my biggest influence growing up was the Beatles. So I grew up in the 1970s. I was actually born in '69, the year the Beatles broke up. And I probably got my first Beatles album, I think it was Yellow Submarine, at the age of 4 or 5, and wore the grooves out on that one. And also, my parents had Sergeant Pepper's, so I became very familiar with that album at an early age. And then I think by first grade, I was listening to Abbey Road, which I think is a wonderful children's album, as I've written about in blogs in the past. From there, I kind of went backwards into earlier Beatles, Revolver, Rubber Soul, and then all the way back to their earliest albums. So that's why I conceived this idea of an analysis of the Beatles backwards. But actually, this analysis takes us backwards and forwards. I actually came up with this analysis kind of off the cuff at about 2 in the morning and recorded it onto my iPhone. And so what you're going to hear is a slightly edited version of just my thoughts. It's a kind of stream of consciousness, but I was using a Beatles discography to kind of go through methodically, and I chose 5 albums to cover for this piece. So the 5 albums you're going to hear about are Introducing the Beatles, Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sergeant Pepper's, and Abbey Road, which I think are 5 of their finest albums. Doesn't mean that the other ones aren't excellent albums as well, but these are the ones I want to focus on because I think they tell a coherent story about the Beatles, which you're going to hear in a moment. So here we go. Introducing the Beatles came out on VJ Records in July 1963. There's the UK version and the US. I guess this is the US version that I'm thinking of. It has I Saw Her Standing There, Misery, Anna, Chains, Boys, Love Me Do, Baby It's You, Do You Want to Know a Secret, A Taste of Honey, There's a Place, Twist and Shout. There's that album, which really started their career. There's the UK version, which is basically Please Please Me. So it has I Saw Her Standing There, Misery, Anna, Chains, Boys, Ask Me Why, Please Please Me, Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, Baby It's You, Do You Want to Know a Secret, Taste of Honey, There's a Place, Twist and Shout. So it's quite interesting that the American version didn't have the song Please Please Me. So I think all of their influences as they were forming their band and forming their sound and their style. And I think it just reflects how the Beatles were like sponges absorbing all these various influences in music without prejudice. You know, they were taking from so many different musical genres, you know, sophisticated, much more imaginative, creative, lyrical musicians. And obviously, their story has been told again and again. There are dozens of books that you can read to get a sense of their story and how they developed their sound and everything that was going on in their lives. And I think as part of this project, I'm not so interested in telling their own life stories or retelling all the anecdotes that surround their songs, except when really necessary, because I I think the principle of art is that art is transcendent. So it's important to, in a way, detach the artwork from the artist.
of course, it helps to know the lives of the artists, but I find that a lot of the analysis of Beatles gets too caught up in the details of their lives and the anecdotes that they use to explain their art. And I remember in high school we learned about this fallacy of taking the artist at their word. I think great art transcends the artist. So you have to take it out of the context of the artist and what he was going through, because great art tells a much deeper story. Um, it delivers a deeper message, and that's the power of great art. It's transcendent. It's not caught up in the detail. It's not like a diary of that specific person's life or what was going on at that moment. Although some of the Beatles songs are kind of like diaries, journals, journaling their life story. But I think what makes these albums great is that they're archetypal. Each of those albums represents a different stage of human development and also some of the fundamental themes of the human experience. So, you know, going back to the beginning, when they're still kind of coming out of their teenage years and discovering love and sex and kind of the freedom of being of going from being dependent on their parents to being these young adults, and the power, discovering their own power. And those songs are very thrilling, they're very happy and energetic. Not that original, because a lot of their songs, as I said, were covers. So the Beatles were, they started out like a lot of, like most bands, they started out as great cover artists. They were they became masters at covering other people's songs. And they had a couple of their own, but even their own original songs were pretty derivative. Like, they sounded like the artists that they were admiring at the time. So, for example, Please Please Me sounded like Roy Orbison, maybe a sped up version of a Roy Orbison song, whom they deeply admired. So, but obviously they were already showing their creative powers with that first album. But anyway, that album, you know, Please Please Me or Introducing the Beatles, I think that represents the energy, the excitement of youth. Obviously, you know, it's about falling in love. There are a lot of sexual themes in the songs. It's just about kind of libidinous energy, dancing. They were coming out of, playing in Hamburg, coming out of playing in the Cavern Club in Liverpool. So it's really, these are dance tunes. They're meant to get an audience shaking. It's the kind of music that they eventually got whole stadiums of young, especially girls, screaming at the top of their lungs. Um, that kind of libidinous, youthful energy. So but the first stage is youth and pleasure and fun and thrill and kind of all the things that, young people get into. Um, Not too much thought. There's not a lot of, reflection and thought, and it's just a very kind of energetic album. Um, but then, the next albums I think kind of continued in that line, but then they were getting more creative. They were making their own songs, but they were still kind of sounding quite similar. The love songs that they became so famous for in the early '60s. But then represents another stage of their development where they're starting to really think about life and art and music. And, you know, they were at that point hanging out with people like Bob Dylan and, starting to see music as something where you could really express yourself lyrically, poetically. Um, so they're getting beyond the kind of the love songs that they had been famous for up, in the early stage of their career. So this is like 1965. So you can kind of see their develop this rapid development, just within the span of a couple of years. Um, so Rubber Soul, the I grew up with the American version, which starts out with "I've just seen a face," and then it goes into Norwegian Wood. You won't see me. Think for yourself. The word, Michelle. And then side two is It's Only Love. Girl, I'm looking through you. In my life, wait and run for your life. So that was the album that I grew up familiar with, as because I grew up in the USA. So that was the album that we had. Uh, but then there's the British album, which I discovered much later, um, which has starts with "Drive My Car," and that song had been put onto another album that was released in the U.S. So "Drive My Car," Norwegian Wood, "You Won't See Me," "Nowhere Man," "Think for Yourself," "The Word," Michelle, "What Goes On," "Girl," "I'm Looking Through You," "In My Life," "Wait," "If I Needed Someone," and "Run for Your Life." So two slightly different albums. Um, I I really associate Rubber Soul with that song. "I've just seen a face." I just feel like Rubber Soul is not complete without that song. Um, I think that was the better choice than "Drive My Car," to be honest. Um, I'm going to focus on the American version. And hey, that's, the US was their biggest fan base. So I think the albums that sold in the US were, in a sense, more important, at least in terms of their overall popularity, than the original British albums. Um, so that album came out in December 1965. And, I think it represents, um, as I said, more obviously much greater maturity. They're telling stories now. Norwegian Wood is one of the iconic songs. But You Won't See Me is a really interesting song, too. And there's a lot you can say about that song. And they're 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 starting to they're starting to develop a sense of time. Time becomes very important. So it's kind of, you can see it as like there's a lot of loss on this album. There's a sense of the fleeting, they're starting to come out of their youthful period. So life is fleeting, love is transient, that kind of young love. Time marches on. All of these themes that are, people can be deceptive. um, oh my God, my life, in my life. So run for your life. They're starting to think of the bigger picture of life. So it's kind of represents a phase of awareness, a heightened awareness, growing awareness of the temporality of life, from when you're a teenager and you kind of feel like you can live forever, to, oh God, things are going by so fast. Um, Getting much more reflective, but still within the idiom of, popular music as they knew it. Um, but then, 1966, Revolver was then new, another breakthrough album and much deeper than Rubber Soul, much more cynical, starting with Taxman and then Eleanor Rigby, which I would argue was their first masterpiece. That song is just lyrically, it's musically, it's rather simple, but lyrically, it just took them to another level entirely. Some going back to but some more like mature love songs like Here, There, and Everywhere. She said, again, kind of communication, but there's some drug motifs there that you could talk about. Um, Good Day Sunshine, in the British version, And Your Bird Can Sing, which is a lovely song. Dr. Robert, again, kind of referencing the drug culture that they were now a part of. I Want to Tell You, Got to Get You Into My Life. And then, of course, Tomorrow Never Knows, which was another kind of breakthrough in popular music, much more psychedelic than anything, and referencing religion. They're starting to get into kind of mysticism and um, starting to move towards a more focus on religion, on what's the deeper meaning of life. Um, in other words, they're starting to get interesting. It's kind of they're going to college now, for guys who never went to college, who never had a higher education, so to speak. They're kind of this is their now they're going to college. They're studying, they're reading, they're learning. They're kind of getting much more philosophical. Um, so that's Revolver, and then of course, um, 1967, the great Sergeant Pepper's. Um, there's obviously, Sergeant Pepper is still considered one of the greatest popular music albums ever made. It's often ranked as their greatest album. I'm not sure I agree, but that came out in June 1967, and it it has the theme kind of they've disguised themselves as another band, kind of referencing an earlier age, continuing this experimentation that started with Revolver, um, and getting more lyrical, somewhat more reflective and philosophical, with like A Day in the Life, um, more imaginative with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, um, but also, philosophical, mystical, Within Without You. Now they're kind of thinking way forward to, when I'm 64. So they're like projecting themselves way into the future. Um, and then there's just a lot of fun songs about kind of daily life. So it's like, how do we find the deeper meaning in our daily lives and in the places that we happen to be, have grown up in or are living in, kind of the life of the city or of a small town, or going to the park, or and most most Beatles historians would argue that the two songs Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields kind of belong on in with this album, even though they were not on the album. So getting very whimsical and nostalgic about the place where they grew up. So it's kind of like they know they're leaving home. So like she's leaving home, um, and the she could be them. You know, they're leaving home. They're never going to be Liverpudlians again. You know, they're leaving. They've gone out into the world, but they're still grounded. They're deeply grounded in their childhoods, in the memories that they have of growing up there. Um, and not just that, but they ground themselves even further in the history of popular music and popular culture and entertainment in their country. So, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, referencing a circus poster that goes back to maybe the late Victorian age. So and the the style of the music as well. They're referencing music hall music from the 1920s, and they're referencing even earlier stuff, folk tunes that probably go back centuries. So they're kind of getting ready to depart, but they're deeply grounding themselves in in the past. Um, so it's like they're setting off on this much bigger journey, mystical kind of search, but but anchoring themselves in who they are, what the culture that they came from, the people that they grew up with, and so forth. Um, so that's Sergeant Pepper, and then of course they went even further with that with the Magical Mystery Tour, which had some pretty cool songs like "Fool on the Hill" and of course "I Am the Walrus." Really, you know, Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane. I mean, some pretty amazing songs on there. Um, but I think overall the album was just too heavy-handed. They kind of, rather than mm, giving it a subtler message, they kind of put it front and center, like we're going on a magical mystery tour, and look at us, how clever we are. We're going on a bus, and it's kind of it, it kind of parodied. It was like a parody of itself, and it didn't quite work. Whereas Sergeant Pepper, um, Sergeant Pepper, people could kind of indulge in the project because they disguised themselves. They'd put on these costumes on the cover, and they kind of turned themselves into something different. Whereas, yeah, Magical Mystery Tour just didn't quite work as a concept. Um, so we're going to skip that one and then go on to let's skip over 1968, and we're going to skip over the White Album. And I mean, there were some great songs that came out from this period, but let's move on to what was their last and perhaps greatest album, which is Abbey Road. Why is it the greatest? Well, here's my theory of Abbey Road. A lot of people who analyze this album will put it in the context of they were breaking up, but it was a happy album. They wanted to create something happy before they departed, and there's some truth to that. Um, it was the final studio album which George Martin produced. Um, it did represent a collective effort. So they kind of brought their bits and bobs of songs that they were working on. Here are some reasons why I think this was their best creation. Conceptually, it hel- it holds together extremely well. Um, it's the sequence of the songs, the themes that the musical themes within the songs are very coherent. There's a classic element to the music. This is by far their most classical album. It's an album that has resonances with Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. So they're digging even deeper into the wellspring of music. Um, Paul Paul found um, a poem written for a play in like 1600, so going way back in history, Golden Slumbers, which I think is really the keystone to understanding this album. It's that song, and this was my revelation with this album. I won't tell you what I was on, but I remember one day just, I guess, listening or thinking about this album, and it just occurred to me that that's a song about death. The Golden Slumbers is the slumber of death. That's it. And so it's, smiles awake you when you rise. Sleep, pretty darling, do not cry. It's kind of like a laying down to death. It's the death of the Beatles. It's an acceptance. I will sing a lullaby. I think what it's saying is we have to accept death, and we have to tell ourselves kind of the myth that we continue to live on after we die. Um, we need to tell ourselves that myth, and that's what all religion tells us. Um, that our souls continue to live, or that we're reborn. Um, but it's a myth. You die, you die. You're gone. And I think they kind of understood that, and that was deeply embedded into this album. They knew that after this album, the Beatles would be gone. There would be no more Beatles. They would live on as individuals, but the magic that they had woven together as four musicians would never exist again. Would it be transcendent? Would it stand the test of time? I'm sure that they were wondering, how long are we we were this incredible band, but how are we just a product of the 60s, or will this last on? And what will we do as individuals? So I think all that's woven into this album. And I liken this album to Dante. Um, the first side is the Inferno. That's the hell. Maybe it's the hell that they were going through as they broke up. Terrible fights over money, over artistry. Um, they were probably going through a kind of a personal hell because they were very sad that this couldn't last. Um, and I think they all, they had gone through so much together, so it was kind of like a divorce in a way. The band breaking up as they went on with their lives. Um, and like a divorce, it was pretty messy. There was a lot of anger and a lot of resentment and negative feelings, and you know that really comes out on the first side of the album, um, with like, I want you. She's so heavy. Oh Darling. I mean, there's a lot of screaming, there's a lot of, you know, emotions, a lot of pent up emotions and anger on this first side. Maxwell's Silver Hammer, that's an interesting one. Um, was is this? I don't think that that song can be taken literally. I think it has to be. I think this the hammer is figurative. I think it's a metaphor. The hammer of justice, the hammer of freedom. It was they're they're smashing a relationship in order to gain their freedom, their artistic and personal freedom. They're breaking up what was the greatest band on earth in order to attain their own freedom and peace of mind. I think if you analyze that song, it's all about smashing authority figures. There's kind of a cultural revolution aspect to it. Um, I can even kind of see a cultural revolution poster in my mind of a young revolutionary with a hammer trying to smash all the olds. And maybe that's what it's referencing, just smashing, teachers, old girlfriends, or judges, kind of people who are holding you back. So I think it has to be taken figuratively. I don't think it's literally a story about a serial killer. And especially because it's told and sung in such a whimsical way. Obviously, this is not a Peter Gabriel, like, serial killer kind of song. Yeah, so the whole first side just has this, there's it's dark, it's earthy, it's fair, it's the inferno. Here come old flat top, it's that come together song, which is about as creepy a song as you can get, as bluesy and dark and, from the earth, from the ground up. Um, and Octopus's Garden thrown in there is kind of an underworld sort of adventure, caves and darkness and something primordial. And, an octopus is kind of a fearsome creature. You don't really want to, be swimming and kind of come across an octopus um, all suddenly without warning. So, it's that's the dark side of the album, and represents kind of the winter of their discontent and their aggression and anger, um, and then you turn the side over and it's the paradise. Now they're ascending to heaven. So the flip side is, Here Comes the Sun, one of the most joyful popular songs ever made. It's every winter, it's it's a song that you sing in March when the flowers start to bloom again after a long, cold, lonely winter. So that was George Harrison, and that was his kind of sense of freedom and happiness, that he was no longer a Beatle. He could find his own destiny now. He had so much to share that had been suppressed by the Beatles, and now he was going to let it all out. Then You Never Give Me Your Money, which is such a deep song, it's a sad, but it's also about freedom, about, crossing bridges and, leaving a place that you'll never go back to. And so you're sad about that, but you're now finding your freedom, and you're kind of finding yourself, a self that had been lost. And then the whole medley, of course, which is just a brilliant concoction of these old bits, scraps of songs that they had been working on that had never really gelled into full songs, and they put them together in this medley, and somehow it worked. So it ends the album with this, and it's very kind of dreamlike. It's like I said, it's very heavenly. The Sun King, a lot of themes of sun and light and joy, and then you kind of go back to these mundane characters, but they're very Mean Mr. Mustard, Polythene Pam, kind of the people that you might see on the streets in Liverpool or in the clubs. Um, but they're very iconic, very archetypal figures. And then she came in through the bathroom window. I mean, that song I think you can only understand by knowing the anecdote about the Apple Scruffs and Paul and kind of the end of Apple Records, but you could also see it as kind of, I guess it's their relationship to their fans, in general, that their fans are just invading their private space, and they're kind of sick of that. They're ready to move on. And then of course Golden Slumbers, which I already explained, is kind of, it's a poem, ancient, not ancient, but several hundred years old poem, which I think was about death and kind of the mythology of rebirth that that we're told like a bedtime story. And then finally, the end. It's the end. Um, and that's where they all come together for this jam session, which is quite amazing. It really, and then of course Paul's statement about the love you take is equal to the love you make. Um, and what he's saying is, life is finite. Um, we we don't know what's going to happen after we die. We don't know that we produce will be remembered or cherished. But at the end, it all equals out. What you take is equal to what you make. So whatever you consume or enjoy ultimately is going to be equal to what you produce in the world. If you're loved by people, it means that you loved them. You can't get anything for free. You have to put in as much as you get out. So it's an interesting way. It's a final message, and then of course, there's that the final thing tacked on, which was just a kind of a whimsical mistake that they decided to keep, which was the little bit, Her Majesty. It's such an unfinished little. I mean, it sounds almost like a jazz song from the 1920s. It's very kind of classic, early early 1920s popular song, um, in its structure. And it could have been something much, much bigger and much more joyous, but they just kind of just tacked it on at the very end of the album as kind of a little surprise, very folksy little bit. But all their songs can be played in so many different ways. But what I really so there's the heaven and the hell motif, the Dante's Inferno to the paradise, and kind of ascending, I think they're ascending to the pantheon of the heavenly pantheon. They'll always be known as this great band, seminal band. And they kind of, I think they recognized that they would, the band would outlive them. Um, they would go on as individuals, but nothing would ever be as important as the Beatles in their lives. Even though it was so short, so fleeting, it just passed by in like 6, 8 years, and then they get to live the rest of their lives. So I think structurally and musically, that album really came together. There are so many recurring motifs and themes, and I think in a way it was kind of like their Ninth Symphony. When you listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, it encapsulates pretty much everything that that he was known for musically, and just takes it all to greater and greater heights. And it's about joy and about the beauty of humankind, and about art and love. And I think that that was the message of Abbey Road as well. It was kind of continuing on from just that. So love in a way is kind of the message, that love is transcendent. You know, it started out with the childish. It starts out with the teenage love, which is kind of a lusty love, but a kind of a zest for life. And then they got more reflective over time, and more imaginative and lyrical and transcendent. And then finally, but it's always cycling back to that message about love. And that never left, so love was always the message. In a way, very Christian, I suppose, that you have to love the world. You have to love the people in the world, even though they'll let you down, even though there will be nasty breakups, there will be wars, there will be death, there will be struggle. But the only way for us to keep going on is to have just believe in the power of love, believe that there's some kind of greater power, and that love is coursing through the universe. And that was kind of the deepest message, I think, that resonated through their music.